There's an old story about the guy that joins the monastery where all the monks are only allowed to say two words every year. And so he comes in at the end of the first year to the abbot in charge of the monastery. His two words are food, bad. And so the abbot writes that down in the book of records. And so the next year he comes in and his two words are bed, hard. And so he comes in at the end of the third year and says room, cold. And so he comes in at the end of the fourth year and says, I quit. And the abbot looks down at the book of records and says, well, you might as well quit. You haven't done anything but complain since you've been here. Well, we know people that do complain all the time. It seems that everything they can find something about it to complain about. It's not a matter of the glass being half empty or half full. They don't like the glass. They don't like what you're putting in the glass. They don't like the way you're pouring the glass. They complain about everything. The problem is they don't realize that they are complaining. They don't realize how they sound to other people. Now, my dad was not a complainer. He was one of the hardest working people I know. But he didn't like taxes. He didn't like doing taxes. He didn't like paying taxes. He didn't like the way the government spent his money when they collected it in taxes. So one day we're on the golf course and he says, evidently it was tax season and he was not in a good mood. He said, I'm having to pay more in extra taxes this year than you're going to make. And I stood there and stared at him for a second and said, Dad, if you're waiting for me to feel sorry for you, we're going to be here a while. Yeah, sometimes we just don't realize how we come across to other people. And there are several problems with complaining. We really do bring down the people around us. Maybe they're having a good day and they don't have a good day after listening to us. But not only that, it's very discouraging and you sort of get tired and resentful if somebody complains all the time. And not only can it mess up someone else's day, it can mess up your own day. Complaining is kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you're looking for things to complain about, you'll find them. And then what could have been a good thing turns out not being so good. And not only that, we stop and don't realize that complaining never does any good. It never changes anything. It was Mark Twain who said, everybody who complains about the weather, but hardly anyone does anything. And, that's true about most things. We complain, but it doesn't do any good. And those are real problems with complaining. But the one that compounds all of those is that complaining is very much like other slips of the lip, like gossip and bragging. And that is the people that are most guilty at it don't realize they're doing it. You go up to the biggest gossip that you know and confront them on their gossip, chances are they won't even know they've been doing that. Same way with bragging. And that's the problem with complaining, is that all of us have that little negative Nancy mode that we can slip into without even realizing that we are, and we can find ourselves complaining. So if everyone slips into that from time to time, is it really that big of a deal? Well, the story we're going to look at this morning in the book of Exodus guarantees us that it is a very big deal. Last week we saw Moses and Miriam lead the children of Israel in praise and worship after the victory at the Red Sea. They praised the God that saved them. They praised God for his power and his might as shown over the Egyptians. They praised God because he was their God, and they worshiped and praised him. And they praised God because he was going to lead them on to the promised land. But then no sooner had Miriam put down her tambourine than they started complaining. And that complaining about not having enough water, and then, as we'll see this morning, not having enough food, and becomes a pattern that leads to their total destruction. They go from praising and worshiping God for his salvation. 3 days later, they're griping and complaining and creating that pattern that will lead them not to get to the promised land. It culminates in the confrontation after they refuse to cross over Jordan. Look at Numbers chapter 14, beginning with verse 27.
Said to Moses and Aaron,
How long will this wicked community grumble against me?
I have heard the complaints of these grumbling Israelites. So tell them, as surely as I live, declares the Lord, I will do to you the very thing I heard you say. In this wilderness, your bodies will fall, every one of you 20 years old or more, who was counted in the census and who has grumbled against me. Not one of you will enter the land I swore with uplifted hand to make your home, except Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, son of Nun. As for your children that you said would be taken as plunder, I will bring them in to enjoy the land you have rejected. But your bodies will fall in this wilderness. Your children will be shepherds here for 40 years, suffering for your unfaithfulness until the last of your bodies lies in the wilderness. For 40 years, 1 year for each of the 40 days you explored the land, you will suffer for your sins and know what it is like to have me against you. I, the Lord, have spoken, and I will surely do these things to this whole wicked community which has banded together against me. They will meet their end in this wilderness. Here they will die.
This morning we want to look at Exodus 16, the first part of that chapter, and see what I'm calling the Grumble, Tumble, and the problems that can be seen in their complaining and some applications that we can make to our own lives. 3 different problems we'll look at. First of all, it was a gratitude problem. Their complaining showed that they were not indeed grateful to God, that though they sang praises, they really didn't understand the debt of gratitude that they owed. Look at Exodus 16, verses 1 and 2. The whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came through the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 5th day of the 2nd month after they had come out of Egypt. So 2 weeks and 1 day. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. Okay, so it mentions just over 2 weeks they are out of Egypt, and they go through the desert, and by definition there's just not a lot of stuff in the desert, and they begin to grumble against Moses and Aaron. Kant said that ingratitude is the essence of vileness. And here, just after seeing the glory and power of God and his leading them out of slavery and leading them to victory, they begin to complain. They show no gratitude to God. They're free from slavery, but they're hungry and they're tired, and they don't believe that God is going to care for them. For the first time in generations, the Israelites don't have to get up and do what they're told to do. They don't have any pyramids to build. They don't have any taskmasters cracking the whip. They are free. They have been liberated, and they're going to the promised land, but they are hungry. It was Patrick Henry that said, "Give me liberty or give me death." Here the Israelites are saying, "Give me a sandwich or we're going back to Egypt." The ingratitude is astounding here. They begin to complain because they don't show enough gratitude to God. Now, Jesus tells us not to worry about what we are going to eat or what we're going to drink, the very things that the Israelites are complaining about here. Why don't complain about those things? Well, first of all, worry doesn't work. He says in verse 27 of Matthew 6, "Can any of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life?" Or the alternate reading, "add a single cubit to your height?" Worry doesn't do anything. We don't accomplish anything by our worry. And secondly, if we have faith, then we've got to believe that God has us. So he goes on to say in verse 31, So do not worry, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? For the pagans run after these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you have need of them. He goes on to tell us to seek first the kingdom and of God and his power, and all those things will be added to us. But if we really believe that God has us, then we're not going to complain about things that don't seem to be going our way. What do you call it when you disagree with the way God is taking care of you? Okay, don't worry about material things. God's going to take care of that. But, I'm not really sure God's doing such a good job. What happens when I pray, Lord, won't you buy me a Mercedes Benz? And God gets me a Ford or a bicycle or a sturdy pair of shoes. You see, when I complain about what I don't have, I am ungrateful for the things that I do have. That's ingratitude. And that is one of the sins in complaining. I mean, think about it. We realize this, right? Over 2 billion people in the world don't have drinking water that is near clean drinking water that's close by. 2 billion people. About 1/3 of the world's population can't do easily what we're being told to do during this pandemic. We've all those signs that are here in the building in our bathrooms teaching us how to wash our hands. Yeah, about 1/3 of the world's population does not have the facilities in their residence to be able to wash their hands. They have to go somewhere looking for running water to wash their hands. 3.5 billion people on earth don't have sanitary waste measures that allows them to have their drinking water separated safely from their waste. You see, when I complain about what I don't have, when I complain about how things are going, I am throwing these blessings. We can walk to the tap and get water anytime we want to. We can walk, the next room or down the hall, and there's a bathroom there. We have these blessings that many people in the world don't have. And when we complain about other things, we are telling God that we simply are not grateful. Secondly, they have a memory problem. Their griping and complaining shows that or contributes to this idea of false memories that they're having of how good the past was. So in verse 3, the Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted, but you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death. They had been slaves in Egypt at the beck and call of their slave masters. But the way they are remembering things is totally different. Their griping and complaining and grumbling have caused them to forget the reality of the past, so they don't put their faith in God for the future. You remember the way that it's described. There's these three verses at the end of Exodus 2 that we saw that sort of describes Israel's plot in Egypt, sort of a summary right before introducing Moses. It was like this in Exodus 2, verse 23. During that long period, the king of Egypt died, and the Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered the covenant with Abraham and with Isaac and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them, and then the story of their liberation begins. We can understand them groaning while in slavery, right? They are crying out to God. The word there is actually a different word. Groaning is the sound you make when you're hurting, when you're struggling. So they call out to God for help. We understand that. But now he has helped them. And they're looking back at the past and saying, oh boy, we had it good back in Egypt. They're groaning in their slavery, and now they're complaining about the hardship of the journey and say, boy, we wish we could go back and be slaves again. We had plenty of food back in Egypt. This nostalgia for the good old days is almost comical. What they're longing for are the return to the days of slavery. When we have this tendency to think, we really need good, it would be really good if we could go back to the good old days. Well, God tells us not to do that. Ecclesiastes 7 and verse 10, do not say, why were the old days better than these? For it is not wise to ask such questions. It's not wise to ask those questions on a couple of different levels. First of all, what we're doing there is selective memory. We are remembering the good things from the past. They remember they had plenty of food, but they're forgetting all of the bad things. They were slaves that were abused for 18 hours a day, but all they can remember is the good things. We do have a tendency to delete the bad things from our memory and glorify only the good things of the past. That's what we're talking about when we talk about the good old days. To tell you the truth, I like indoor plumbing. And I like air conditioning. I like the fact that I never had to worry about my kids catching polio the way that my parents had to worry before we had the vaccine available. There's a lot of things about the past that were terrible. And when we glorify the past by saying if we just could return to the good old days, we are choosing to forget. It's an interesting story in Psalm 137. The psalmist is singing by the waters of Babylon. The Babylonians are asking him to sing the songs of Israel. How can I play the songs of Israel in a foreign land? But what that doesn't mention is the reason they're in that foreign land is because the Jews weren't singing enough of those songs of Israel. They weren't following God and seeking God and serving God when they were in their homeland. So we do have a way of doing this selective memory thing. And then secondly, when we look back on the good old days, we do that just selfishly. The good old days were good old days, but they were good old days for me, not necessarily for other folks. I remember Lynn Anderson talking about going to a Bible conference that was around the theme of God's family values or something like that. And so speaker after speaker, he said, we're talking about the good old days and family values and the way that we used to be faithful in the past. The closing prayer of the conference was led by a very prominent Black Baptist pastor who got up and began his prayer by saying, Lord, please don't let us go back to the good old days. Some of us just couldn't stand it. Yeah, we tend to glorify the past, but only in ways that benefit us. Grumbling and complaining caused Israel to selectively remember the good things about the past selfishly, and they forgot about the good things that God had done in liberating them and bringing them to freedom. And then third, ultimately, grumbling and complaining showed a faith problem. In Exodus 16, verses 7 and 8, it was Moses preparing Israel for God's coming. God's going to give them food, and they need to prepare themselves. He says this. We'll talk more about that in the lesson next week. And in the morning you will see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we that you should grumble against us? And then later he continues, you are not grumbling against us, but against the Lord. You see, Moses is emphasizing to Israel all this grumbling and complaining. You've been doing it to me, but you're not complaining about me. You're complaining about God. And understand, God is hearing your ingratitude. God is hearing your grumbling. Suppose you're on a bus. And the bus is swerving around some curves, and you don't like the way the guy's driving the bus, and you don't like the speed that he's driving the bus, and you just don't like anything about the way this guy's driving the bus. And so you turn to your fellow passenger and you complain about, boy, this guy doesn't know how to drive a bus. Well, you're complaining to your fellow passenger, but you're complaining about the one who's in control of the bus. And we need to understand all the time that we spend complaining to other people about how things are going and how bad our boss is and how dilapidated our house is or how much I need a new car or whatever it is that we're complaining about. When we grumble and complain, we're not complaining about the people around us or even about our situation. We're complaining about how God is controlling his world. And Moses assures us here that God hears us when we grumble and complain. Now we don't have to like the way the world is going. And God even allows us not to like the way he's ruling his world as long as we complain in the right way, right? When we complain to God, it's called prayer. So in Psalm 55, verse 16, as for me, I call to the Lord, and the Lord saves me. Evening, morning, and noon, I cry out in distress, and he hears my voice. To complain and gripe and grumble like Israel does is caused by a lack of faith. But when we cry out to God in our distress, it is an act of faith. And we need to make sure we keep those two straight. We want to dismiss grumbling and complaining as just a quirk of personality. Some people are like that. They just grumble and complain about everything. But Moses assures us that's not the way that God sees it. The God rather sees it as a lack of gratitude. When we complain about one thing, it is overlooking all of the good things that God has done for us. It's also a failure of memory. We don't remember all of the things in the past that were good that God has done, and they are a guarantee of how God is going to work in our future. And ultimately, therefore, grumbling and complaining is a failure of faith. When we grumble and complain, we simply don't have enough faith. These are not grumbling, complaining, moaning and groaning, grumbling, not simply a quirk of personality. These cause us to miss the glory of God. Grumbling and complaining led an entire generation of Israelites to miss the promised land. An entire generation that left Egypt singing, I'm bound for the promised land, their eyes on this new home. They never would get there because they let the dangers and hardships of the journey cause them to grumble and complain to the Lord. We cannot believe that God is any more pleased when we grumble. Remember, that's the point that Moses makes in 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 10. He tells the story of the Exodus, and he says, and do not grumble as some of them did and were killed by the destroying angel. God is not happy with us when we grumble and complain about everything. Let me leave you with something that Paul says about grumbling and complaining. We're familiar with the text that tells us, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Philippians 2 and verse 12. We have to work out our salvation. Doesn't mean we have to jump through all the right theological hoops and take all of the correct theological steps and get everything in the right way, in the right order, rightly defined and all of that. But it does mean that when we are saved by grace, we respond in obedience and seeking to do God's will. And there's a continual process. So we continue to work out that. But Paul wants us to understand that we're not in this alone, that we don't have to work out our salvation alone, because ultimately, the very next verse, for it is God who works in you and to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose. So it's God that is working in you. It is God who is at work. And so we got to work out our salvation, but God is going to help us to do that. But the question is how? How do we go about working out our salvation? Well, in the context that Paul is writing to, encouraging a congregation to be at Philippi to be more together and more unified, he stresses that in every chapter of this short letter. Either work out your salvation, God working in you. How is that seen? Next verse. Do everything without grumbling or arguing, that you may become blameless and pure children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation, and then you will shine among them like stars. How is it that we work out our salvation with fear and trembling? How is it that we allow God to work in us? How is it that we shine like stars in the sky? We get along, we work together as the people of God without grumbling and arguing. Our ability to take the slings and arrows of life throws at us, trusting in God and relying on each other without grumbling and complaining about what happens. That shows that we are the true children of God. That shows that we are the saved people of God. That stands out in a dark world and points to the truth of God. Indeed, the children of Israel fell in the wilderness because of a lack of faith. But that lack of faith showed itself by a constant complaining about the difficulties of the journey. When things didn't go their way, they whined and whimpered and wanted to quit. I think that if we look very closely and think very hard, we might find an application or two in that for us.